In Willowmere, there is a bakery window that glows long after the rest of the village has gone dark. Small square of warm light in a world that can feel heavy sometimes. And inside, before anyone else is awake, a woman moves through the quiet with flour on her hands and responsibility in her chest, as if feeding everyone is simply what she was made for. It is early March now. Winter still clings to the mornings, cold and stubborn, but something has begun to shift. The air is softer, the world is loosening, and, for the first time in a long while, relief feels possible. Not as a miracle, but as a choice. Tonight, we follow the woman who has always been the one who gives, the one who keeps going, the one who says, "I am fine," even when she is not, until someone in Willowmere does something she is not used to at all. They notice, they come close, and they offer help. And slowly, she learns something that can be harder than any early morning, that you are allowed to need, that you are allowed to ask, that letting someone care for you does not make you weak. It makes you human. There is nothing you need to do now, nothing you need to fix. Just listen and let this story hold you gently. And before we begin, one small thing from woman to woman. If you are still here with me and these stories comfort you, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me feel less alone when I share these quiet little worlds with you. The alarm sounded at 3:45 in the morning, the way it had sounded every morning for the past 12 years, and she woke instantly, her body trained beyond the need for gradual consciousness, moving from sleep to alertness in the space between one breath and the next, because that was what bakers did, what she did, what she had always done since the day she'd taken over this small bakery from her aunt who had run it for 30 years before that. She lay in the dark for exactly 1 minute, not because she needed that minute to wake, but because she had learned that if she didn't give herself at least this small pause, if she launched directly from sleep into motion, her body would eventually rebel in ways that couldn't be ignored. And so she lay there, beneath blankets that held the last traces of warmth from the night, and listened to the silence of Willowmere in these hours before dawn, when even the most dedicated insomniacs had finally surrendered to sleep, and the village existed in that particular stillness that comes only in the deepest part of night. Then she rose, her movements automatic and efficient, the choreography of morning so ingrained she could perform it without thought clothes pulled from the chair where she'd set them out the night before. Face washed with cold water that shocked her fully awake, hair twisted into the same practical bun she'd worn for years, secured with pins that were older than some of the buildings in Willowmere. She moved through her small apartment above the bakery without turning on lights, her feet knowing every creaking board, every uneven patch of floor, navigating by memory, and the faint illumination that filtered up from the street lamps outside. The bakery waited below, dark and cool, and smelling faintly of yesterday's bread, that yeasty sweetness that never quite left the walls, no matter how thoroughly she cleaned, as though the building itself had absorbed decades of baking and now exhaled it constantly, a reminder of all the loaves that had been shaped here, all the morning routines that had unfolded in this space, all the people who had been fed by work that began when the rest of the world was sleeping. She unlocked the door between her apartment and the bakery proper and descended the narrow stairs, her hand trailing along the wall for balance, though she hardly needed it anymore, her body understanding this journey in ways that transcended conscious thought. At the bottom, she flipped the switches that brought the space to life, overhead lights that hummed slightly before settling into their steady glow, the ovens that would need 30 minutes to reach proper temperature, the radio that she kept tuned to a station that played gentle music at this hour, nothing jarring, just soft melodies to accompany the work. The kitchen spread before her in organized familiarity, everything in its place because she had arranged it that way, had spent years refining the layout until every tool and ingredient was exactly where her hands expected to find it, minimizing wasted motion, maximizing efficiency, because when you began work at 4 in the morning and didn't finish until 6 in the evening, efficiency wasn't a luxury, but a necessity, the difference between sustainable labor and complete exhaustion. She tied on her apron white canvas, stained despite countless washings. The fabric softened by use until it felt like a second skin, and began the work that her hands could perform without her mind's full attention, which was fortunate because her mind felt thick this morning, sluggish in a way that suggested she hadn't slept well, though she couldn't quite remember why, couldn't recall if she'd woken in the night or simply failed to achieve deep rest, the distinction blurring into irrelevance, because either way she was here now, and the bread needed making regardless of how she felt. The sourdough starter waited in its covered crock, and she checked it first, stirring the thick mixture and noting its sour-sweet smell, the bubbles that indicated the wild yeasts were active and ready. This starter was older than her tenure at the bakery, passed down from her aunt who had received it from the previous baker, a living thing that connected her to decades of bread making in Willowmere, and caring for it was both practical necessity and something like ritual, this daily feeding and stirring that kept the culture alive. She began mixing dough, her hands moving through the familiar sequence flour from the large bin, water at precisely the right temperature, salt measured by feel as much as by weight, the starter added in proper proportion. Her hands plunged into the mixture, feeling it transform under her touch from separate ingredients into cohesive mass, the gluten beginning to develop as she worked it, stretching and folding, the rhythm as natural as breathing. This was the work she loved, had always loved, this transformation of simple elements into something that would nourish. There was magic in it, she thought, though she rarely articulated this to anyone, aware that it might sound foolish, but it was true nonetheless. This ability to take flour and water and time and heat and create something essential something that had sustained humans for millennia, something that made houses smell like home. While the first batch of dough rested, she prepared the day's pastries, rolling butter into layers of dough for croissants, a process that required patience and cold hands and precise folding, each turn creating the delicate layers that would puff and separate in the oven's heat. Her back ached slightly as she leaned over the work table, a persistent discomfort she'd learned to ignore. The price of this work that demanded hours of standing, of bending, of repetitive motion. By 5:30, the first loaves were shaped and resting in their baskets, covered with cloth to prevent drying while they underwent their final rise. The ovens had reached temperature, their interiors glowing with heat that rolled out in waves whenever she opened the doors. The croissants were ready for baking, arranged on trays with space between them to allow for expansion. She slid the first tray into the oven and set the timer, then moved to mix the next batch of dough because bread making was an orchestrated sequence, each stage overlapping with others, early loaves baking while later ones were still being shaped, the day's production requiring careful timing to ensure that everything was ready when the shop opened at 7. The radio played something soft and instrumental, barely audible beneath the sounds of her work, the scrape of the dough scraper against the counter, the rustle of parchment paper, the quiet hum of the ovens doing their essential work. Outside, the sky was beginning its slow transition from black to grey. That gradual lightening that suggested dawn was approaching, though the sun itself remained hidden below the horizon. She paused for a moment, allowing herself to lean against the counter, and felt the exhaustion that lived permanently in her bones these days, the weariness that no single night's sleep could address, because it had been accumulating for months, maybe years, layered like sediment until it had become her baseline state, so constant. She hardly noticed it anymore, except in moments like this, when she stopped moving and felt the full weight of it. But there was no time for this noticing, no space for acknowledging that she was tired, because the timer was chiming and the croissants needed removing and the next batch needed starting, and the village would wake soon, would come to her door expecting fresh bread and warm pastries, and the reassurance that some things remained constant, that no matter what changes or difficulties life brought, the bakery would be here, would be open, would smell of yeast and butter and everything comforting about morning. So she pushed off from the counter and returned to work, her hands moving through motions they had performed thousands of times, shaping sustenance from flour and water and time, feeding everyone who would walk through her door today, never turning anyone away, always having something extra for those who needed it most, because this was what she did, who she was, the role she had claimed or that had claimed her, and there was satisfaction in it even through the exhaustion, purpose in it even through the ache. The first customers wouldn't arrive for another hour, but she worked as though they were already waiting, because in a sense they were the village depending on her, trusting her, expecting that when they woke, and wanted bread, it would be there, still warm, exactly as it always was. And it would be because she would make it so, even if making it so required everything she had. The first customer arrived at 7 o'clock exactly the way Mrs. Patterson always did, her timing so precise you could set your watch by it, though she herself claimed to never look at clocks, said she simply felt when it was time to leave her cottage and walk the 3 blocks to the bakery, arriving just as the sign was being flipped from closed to open, just as the morning's first batch was cooling on the racks behind the counter, still radiating the warmth that made the entire shop feel like an embrace. She was there at the door as the woman turned the lock, her face breaking into that familiar smile that had greeted her every morning for 12 years. And the baker smiled back, even though her face felt stiff with tiredness, even though the effort of arranging her features into warmth required more energy than it should, because this was part of the work too. Not just the bread itself, but the welcome that came with it. The reassurance that someone was happy to see you, that your arrival mattered, that this small transaction of coin for carbohydrate was also an exchange of care. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying that particular quality of elderly women who have lived long enough to stop worrying about whether they're being too familiar, who call everyone dear and love and sweetheart without irony or condescension, just genuine affection extended to anyone who crosses their path. "It smells like heaven in here, as always." "Good morning," the baker replied, moving behind the counter with practiced efficiency, her hands already reaching for the paper bags and the tongs, knowing without asking what Mrs. Patterson wanted, because it never varied. 1 sourdough loaf, sliced, and 2 almond croissants, 1 for today and 1 to save for tomorrow. Though they both knew she would probably eat both today, because that's what happened with fresh pastries. They demanded to be consumed immediately, their warm flakiness too tempting to resist. She wrapped everything carefully, the way she always did, taking time to fold the bag just so, even though Mrs. Patterson would open it the moment she left the shop, unable to wait even until she reached home, and as she worked her hands moved with the muscle memory of thousands of similar transactions, efficient but not rushed, careful but not precious, finding that balance between speed and attention that good service required. "You look tired, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, and the observation landed with more weight than it should have, settling in the baker's chest like something heavy, because she had been trying so hard not to look tired, had applied extra concealer under her eyes this morning, had forced brightness into her expression, and if Mrs. Patterson could see through all that, then perhaps everyone could. Perhaps her exhaustion was more visible than she'd realized. "Just busy," she said, keeping her voice light, dismissive, the way you do when you don't want to acknowledge what's being seen. Spring always brings more customers, people wanting fresh bread after the long winter. It wasn't entirely true. March was actually one of the slower months, the gap between winter holidays and spring celebrations leaving a lull in business, but it sounded plausible enough, gave Mrs. Patterson something to nod at sympathetically before taking her bag and leaving with promises to return tomorrow at the same time. As reliable as sunrise, as constant as the baker's own schedule. More customers came as the morning progressed, a steady stream of familiar faces ordering familiar things, and she greeted each one with practiced warmth, asked about their families and their work and their small concerns, remembered that Mr. Chen's daughter was expecting her first baby soon, that the woman from the bookshop preferred her bread without seeds, that the teacher from the school liked her coffee cake slightly warmed, the glaze still soft and melting. She remembered everything about everyone because that was part of caring for people, wasn't it? This attention to their preferences and their lives, this making them feel seen and known and valued, and she took pride in it, even as it exhausted her, even as each conversation required energy she wasn't sure she had to spare. Her smile beginning to feel like something she wore rather than something that came naturally. The mother came in mid-morning, as she usually did after the initial rush had cleared, and ordered her weekly supply, enough bread and rolls to feed her family, plus whatever unexpected guests might appear. Because her kitchen table was the kind of place where people gathered, where neighbors stopped by for tea and stayed for lunch, where no one was ever turned away hungry. She and the baker had this in common, this instinct to feed, to nurture, to make sure everyone around them was cared for, and they recognized it in each other without needing to name it. This shared understanding of what it meant to center your life around other people's sustenance. "You're looking pale," the mother said, her voice carrying that particular concern that mothers have, that radar for distress that operates independently of what you claim about your well-being. "Are you eating enough? Getting enough rest?" The baker laughed, though it came out more strained than she intended, and deflected with practiced ease. "You know how it is with bakers, we're always up before the sun. Makes us look like vampires after a while." But the mother's eyes stayed on her a moment longer, assessing, seeing more than the baker wanted seen, before nodding slowly and gathering her bags, though not before saying, "You take care of everyone else, dear. Don't forget to take care of yourself too." The words followed her through the afternoon, echoing in the back of her mind as she continued serving customers, continued pulling fresh loaves from the oven and arranging pastries in the display case and wiping down counters and sweeping floors, the endless cycle of bakery work that began before dawn and didn't end until closing. And even then, the work continued, cleaning, preparing for tomorrow, making sure everything was ready for the next morning's early start. By 3 o'clock, she realized she hadn't eaten anything since the single piece of toast she'd managed before beginning work at 4 that morning, her stomach existing in that strange state, past hunger where it had given up asking and simply accepted emptiness as its default condition. She should eat something, she knew this. Should take one of the sandwiches she'd made earlier specifically for the lunch rush. Should sit down for 10 minutes and give her body the fuel it needed to continue functioning. But there were still customers coming through the door, still loaves that needed checking in the oven, still the constant low-level vigilance that running a bakery required. And so she kept moving, kept working, kept pushing through the exhaustion and the hunger and the persistent ache in her lower back that had been there for so long it had become part of her baseline experience, barely noticeable, except when she paused long enough to feel it. The post carrier came by around 4, his usual time, ordering coffee and whatever pastry looked good to him today, and they exchanged their usual pleasantries, the comfortable conversation of people who saw each other daily without being exactly friends, just friendly, existing in that pleasant space of mutual regard without deeper intimacy. "Long day?" he asked, and she nodded, smiling that smile she'd been wearing for 11 hours now. "Every day is a long day in this business," she said, meaning it as a joke, but hearing how it landed flat, how the truth beneath the humor was too heavy to be lightened by tone alone. He looked at her the way Mrs. Patterson had looked at her, the way the mother had looked at her, that searching gaze, that suggested concern. But before he could say anything, she was moving again, refilling his coffee, pointing out the fresh batch of scones that had just come out, keeping busy, keeping him from asking questions she didn't want to answer about whether she was really okay, whether she needed anything, whether this life she'd built around nourishing others was slowly consuming her from the inside out. By 5 o'clock, the bakery had grown quiet in that particular way small shops do in the late afternoon, after the lunch rush has passed, and before the dinner crowd begins to think about tomorrow's breakfast, leaving a pocket of stillness that felt almost luxurious after the constant motion of the day, though the baker knew it wouldn't last, that there would be a few more customers before closing at 6, people stopping by on their way home from work, picking up something for their evening meal or their morning toast. She used the lull to begin the closing routine, starting the cleaning that would need to be finished before she could lock the door and climb the stairs to her apartment, though calling what waited above a routine felt too generous more often than not. She would eat something standing at the kitchen counter, would perhaps watch television for an hour, before exhaustion pulled her toward bed, would lie down, knowing she needed to sleep, but finding it difficult to surrender consciousness when her mind was still cataloging everything that had happened during the day, everything that would need to happen tomorrow, the endless scroll of tasks and responsibilities that defined her existence. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see the cafe listener entering, which was unusual. She typically stayed at her own establishment until closing, the two of them operating on parallel schedules that rarely intersected, despite being only 3 doors apart. They nodded at each other when passing on the street, exchanged brief greetings when one of them stopped by the other's shop, but their relationship existed mostly in this peripheral awareness. Two women who understood each other's work without needing to discuss it, who recognized in each other the particular exhaustion that came from serving others from dawn until dusk. "I hope you're not closed yet," the cafe listener said, though she could clearly see the open sign still displayed, and the baker shook her head. Mustering energy she didn't quite have for this interaction, wondering what had brought her neighbor here at this unusual hour. "Still open for another 40 minutes. What can I get you?" The cafe listener moved to the counter slowly, scanning the reduced selection that remained at day's end, the picked over pastries, the few loaves that hadn't sold, everything looking slightly tired in the way food does after sitting out for hours, though still perfectly good, still fresh by any reasonable standard. "Actually," she said, and something in her tone made the baker pay closer attention, made her register that this visit wasn't just about purchasing bread. "I came to ask if you'd eaten today. Real food, I mean, not just whatever you grabbed between customers." The question landed like an accusation, though the cafe listener's voice held no judgment, only concern, and the baker felt herself bristle reflexively before catching the reaction, recognizing it as defensiveness born from being seen too clearly, from having someone notice what she'd been trying to hide. "I've been busy," she said, which wasn't an answer, but was all she could manage, the admission of not eating feeling somehow like confession of failure, as though proper adults were supposed to maintain basic self-care even when working 14-hour days, as though exhaustion wasn't an acceptable excuse for neglecting fundamental needs. The cafe listener nodded as though this confirmed something she'd suspected, and reached into the bag she'd brought with her, pulling out a container that she set on the counter between them. "I made soup today, more than I can use. It's still warm." The smell reached the baker before her mind could process the gesture vegetable soup, rich and savory, the kind of nourishment her body had been craving without her conscious awareness, and her stomach responded with an audible sound that would have been embarrassing if the cafe listener hadn't smiled gently, pushing the container closer. "You take care of everyone who comes through that door," she said, her voice soft but firm, the tone of someone stating simple fact rather than offering opinion. "Someone should take care of you too, even if it's just soup." The baker felt something tight in her chest, loosened slightly, felt unexpected tears pressing behind her eyes, though she refused to let them fall, refused to break down here in her own bakery over something as simple as soup. Though it wasn't really about the soup, was it? It was about being seen, about someone noticing that she was tired and hungry and giving too much, about having her needs acknowledged when she'd spent so long pretending they didn't exist. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rougher than intended, and the cafe listener nodded once before turning to leave, pausing at the door to look back. "We close at the same time most nights," she said. "If you ever want company for dinner, or just someone to sit with while you eat, My door is open." Then she was gone, the bell chiming her departure, leaving the baker alone with the soup and the weight of unexpected kindness, the strange discomfort of receiving when her entire identity had been built around giving, when accepting care felt almost transgressive, as though she were breaking some unspoken rule about her role in this village's ecosystem. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the container, then glanced at the clock and saw it was nearly 5:30, close enough to closing that she could justify locking up a few minutes early, could claim a small pocket of time for herself before tomorrow's cycle began again. The remaining customers would understand, she told herself, would forgive her this small deviation from absolute reliability. She flipped the sign to closed and locked the door, then carried the soup to the small table at the back of the shop where she usually ate, standing up quickly between tasks. But tonight she sat and she opened the container and she ate slowly, tasting each spoonful, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and belly, nourishing her in ways that went beyond mere calories, reminding her body that it deserved to be fed, that sustenance wasn't something to be earned through exhaustion, but something she was allowed to receive simply because she was human, and humans need food. The soup was gone before she realized how quickly she'd eaten it, her body responding to nourishment with an eagerness that revealed just how depleted she'd become. And when she set down the spoon, she felt simultaneously more energized and more aware of how tired she actually was, as though feeding herself had given her enough strength to finally acknowledge the exhaustion she'd been pushing through. She sat there as the light outside shifted from afternoon to evening, as the shadows lengthened across Willowmere's quiet streets, and let herself simply be for perhaps the first time all day not the baker, not the caregiver, not the person everyone depended on, just herself, tired and grateful, and beginning to understand that maybe, possibly, she couldn't continue like this indefinitely, that something would need to change, even though she had no idea what or how, because this life she'd built felt both essential and unsustainable, both deeply meaningful and slowly crushing her. She climbed the stairs to her apartment slowly, each step requiring conscious effort in a way it hadn't that morning. Her body's reserves finally depleted after 14 hours of constant motion, constant alertness, constant care directed outward, while her own needs accumulated, unaddressed, stacking up like unpaid debts that would eventually demand settlement whether she was ready or not. The apartment greeted her with its familiar emptiness, not lonely exactly, but sparse, functional, the living space of someone who spent so little time here that investing in comfort or beauty felt unnecessary, excessive, as though the apartment was merely a place to sleep between work shifts rather than an actual home. A couch she rarely sat on, a television she mostly used for background noise, a kitchen she hardly cooked in, too tired after making food for others all day to summon energy for preparing her own meals, usually settling for whatever was easiest, quickest, required the least thought. Tonight, though, Fortified by the cafe listener's soup, she felt a small spark of something that might have been energy or might have been simply the absence of immediate hunger. And she moved to the kitchen and put the kettle on, thinking tea might be nice, might help her transition from work mode to rest mode, that liminal space she usually rushed through because sitting still meant feeling everything she'd been pushing down all day. While the water heated, she stood at the window that looked out over Willowmere's main street, watching the village settle into evening, lights coming on in windows across the way, people visible in brief silhouettes as they moved through their homes, preparing dinner or helping children with homework, or simply existing in whatever private ways people existed when they thought no one was watching. She recognized some of the houses, the mother's cottage, where dinner would be underway, probably with extra places set for whoever might stop by. The bookshop woman's apartment above her store, where she would be reading, most likely, a cup of tea going cold beside her. The teacher's small house, where she would be grading papers or preparing tomorrow's lessons, taking her work home the way people in caring professions always did. All of them, she thought, were probably tired too. Probably pushing through their own forms of exhaustion, their own versions of giving more than they had while pretending they had plenty to spare. Perhaps this was just what life required of adults, this constant output, this daily emptying of yourself in service of whatever responsibilities you'd claimed or that had claimed you. And perhaps her weariness wasn't unique, but simply the human condition, the price of being part of a community, of mattering to other people. The kettle whistled and she made her tea, carrying it to the couch where she sat for what felt like the first time in months, actually sat rather than perched, actually let her body relax into the cushions, rather than maintaining the half-ready posture of someone about to stand again, about to return to work, about to do the next thing on an endless list of things requiring doing. The television remained off. The silence felt large at first, uncomfortable in its absoluteness after a day of constant ambient noise, customers chatting, the oven's hum, the radio's steady stream of music. But gradually she adjusted to it, found something almost restful in the absence of input, in being alone with her thoughts. Even if those thoughts weren't particularly pleasant or profound, just the ordinary mental drift of an exhausted person whose mind was too tired for anything complex. She thought about the cafe listener's words. Someone should take care of you too. When had she stopped taking care of herself? Or had she ever, really, even before the bakery, before the 12-hour days and the 4 a.m. starts? She'd been someone who derived satisfaction from nurturing others, who felt most purposeful when feeding people, when creating abundance that could be shared. Her aunt had been the same way, had worked until she physically couldn't anymore, had handed over the bakery only when her body finally refused to cooperate with her desire to continue. And perhaps this was what the baker had been unconsciously modeling herself after, this idea that true dedication meant sacrificing yourself completely, that care for others required neglect of self. But sitting here now, feeling the ache in her spine and the heaviness in her limbs and the persistent fog in her mind that came from months of inadequate sleep and irregular meals, she wondered if there might be another way, if it was possible to nourish others without depleting herself completely. If self-care might not be selfish, but actually necessary for sustainable caregiving, the way airplane safety instructions told you to put on your own oxygen mask before helping others, because you couldn't help anyone if you'd passed out from lack of air. The thought felt both obvious and revolutionary, something she'd known intellectually but had never quite internalized, had never quite believed applied to her, because she was strong enough to push through, resilient enough to manage, didn't need as much rest or food or gentleness as other people seemed to require. Except she did need those things, was needing them right now with an urgency her body could no longer disguise, was perhaps already past the point where need was an accurate description, had progressed into something closer to desperation. Her reserves so depleted that simple acts like climbing stairs or having a conversation required conscious effort. She woke the next morning to her alarm at 3:45, the sound pulling her from sleep that had been deeper than usual, thanks perhaps to the soup that had finally given her body enough fuel to properly rest. Or perhaps to the simple act of sitting still for an hour the night before, of allowing herself to exist without immediately launching into the next task, the next responsibility, the next person who needed feeding. But despite the better sleep, her body felt heavier than usual as she moved through the dark apartment, getting dressed with movements that seemed to require more effort than they should, as though some essential spring inside her had wound down and couldn't quite generate the momentum she needed to carry her through another day of the same routine, the same early start, the same long hours, standing and kneading and serving and smiling until her face ached from the effort of appearing, welcoming, when what she wanted most was to crawl back into bed and sleep for days. She made it downstairs though, because she always made it downstairs. Because the bread needed making regardless of how she felt, because people would come to the bakery at 7 o'clock expecting it to be open, and she couldn't disappoint them, couldn't let her own exhaustion interfere with their need for morning sustenance, their daily bread that had become so reliable they didn't even think about it anymore, just knew it would be there the way they knew the sun would rise. The dough felt heavier in her hands this morning, or perhaps her hands felt weaker, the distinction blurring as she worked through the familiar motions that usually brought comfort, but today just felt like obligation, like labor in the truest sense of the word, something that had to be endured rather than enjoyed. Her back protested as she leaned over the work table, the persistent ache that had been her constant companion for months, suddenly sharper, more insistent, demanding acknowledgement she didn't have time to give. By 6:30, the first loaves were in the oven, and she was mixing pastry dough when she heard something unusual. A knock at the back door, the one that led to the alley behind the bakery, the one that was never used except for deliveries, and those didn't come this early. She wiped flour from her hands and moved to answer it, confused and slightly concerned, because unexpected events at this hour usually meant something had gone wrong, some disruption to the careful routine that kept the bakery functioning. The mother stood there in the dim morning light, holding a covered basket, her face warm with that particular smile that suggested she was bringing help rather than asking for it. And the baker felt something in her chest tighten because she knew what this was. She could recognize an intervention when she saw one, even when it came wrapped in kindness. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," the mother said, though her tone suggested she knew very well she was disturbing, but had decided it was necessary, worth the risk of overstepping. "I've brought breakfast. Thought you might appreciate something hot that you didn't have to make yourself." The baker wanted to refuse, wanted to say she was fine, she'd eat later, she didn't need anyone bringing her food when she ran a bakery, for heaven's sake, when feeding people was literally her profession. But the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere in her throat along with unexpected emotion, because the truth was she hadn't eaten breakfast in months, hadn't taken time for anything more than that single piece of toast before work began, and her body was so hungry it felt like hunger had become her default state, something she no longer even registered as abnormal. "That's very kind," she managed, stepping back to let the mother enter, watching as she moved into the bakery's kitchen with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who understood how commercial kitchens worked and wouldn't be intimidated by the industrial ovens and the professional mixers and the organized chaos of a working bakery. The mother set the basket on the counter and began unpacking it, a thermos of tea, still steaming when she opened it, a container of porridge with honey and fruit, fresh bread that she must have made herself, knowing the baker would appreciate good bread even though she spent her days making it. She arranged everything on a clean section of counter, creating a small breakfast station that looked almost absurdly domestic in the midst of all the professional equipment. "Sit," she said, and it was the voice of someone who had raised children, who knew how to give instructions that sounded like suggestions, but were actually non-negotiable. And the baker found herself sitting on the stool she usually only perched on briefly between tasks, found herself accepting the bowl of porridge that was pressed into her hands, warm through the ceramic, smelling of cinnamon and comfort. "You don't have to do this," she said, though she was already lifting the spoon to her mouth, already tasting the sweetness of honey and fruit, her body responding to nourishment with an eagerness that revealed just how desperately it had been needing this. "I know I don't have to," the mother replied, pouring tea into a mug and setting it within reach. "I want to. You've been feeding this village for 12 years without pause. Someone should feed you back." It was almost exactly what the cafe listener had said the day before, this notion that care should flow both directions, that taking care of others didn't exempt you from needing care yourself, and hearing it twice, in as many days, made it harder to dismiss as unnecessary concern, made her wonder if perhaps everyone had been noticing her decline, had been watching her grow thinner and more exhausted, but hadn't known how to intervene until now, until she'd finally become depleted enough that action felt urgent. "I'm managing," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, a reflexive defense against being seen as struggling, as needing help, as anything less than completely capable of handling whatever her life required. The mother gave her a look that mothers everywhere have perfected, the one that says, "I see through that and we both know it," but her voice when she spoke was gentle rather than scolding. Managing isn't the same as thriving, dear. You're allowed to need more than just survival. You're allowed to want rest, to want nourishment, to want someone to take care of you sometimes. The timer went off then, saving her from having to respond, and she moved to pull the loaves from the oven, grateful for the interruption even as she felt something shifting inside her, some long-held resistance beginning to crack under the weight of repeated kindness, of being cared for despite her protests, of having people refuse to let her martyr herself to exhaustion. The mother didn't leave after the baker finished eating, didn't treat her visit as a simple delivery of food. Instead, she stayed, rolling up her sleeves and asking what needed doing, and when the baker tried to refuse this help too, tried to say she couldn't possibly accept someone working for free in her bakery, the mother simply ignored her and began measuring flour as though she'd done it 1,000 times, which she probably had. Decades of cooking for her family translating easily into bakery work. They worked together as the morning light strengthened beyond the windows, as Willowmere began to wake and prepare for another day. And the baker found herself surprised by how much easier everything felt with someone else sharing the load, how much less exhausting the work became when you weren't carrying it entirely alone. The mother moved through the space with quiet efficiency, asking questions when she needed guidance, but mostly just understanding through years of her own kitchen labor what needed doing and doing it. Kneading dough and shaping rolls and cleaning as she went with the practiced ease of someone who had made feeding others her life's work too. By 7 o'clock, when Mrs. Patterson arrived for her daily order, the bakery was ready, shelves full, the smell of fresh bread filling the air, everything exactly as it always was, except that this time the baker hadn't done it entirely alone, had accepted help, even though accepting felt harder than giving ever had, even though letting someone else into her carefully controlled routine required vulnerability she wasn't sure she possessed. "You have help today, Mrs. Patterson observed, her eyes moving between the baker and the mother with that shrewd awareness elderly people develop, that ability to read situations and understand unspoken dynamics. "That's good. That's very good." And the baker, exhausted but fed, overwhelmed but supported, found herself nodding, found herself agreeing that yes, perhaps it was good. Perhaps she didn't have to do everything alone. Even though independence had always felt like strength and needing, others had always felt like weakness. Perhaps there was another way to live that didn't require emptying herself completely every single day. The mother stayed until mid-morning, until the rush had passed and the baker tried once more to thank her properly, to express gratitude for intervention she hadn't known she needed, and the mother simply smiled and said, "You'd do the same for any of us. You have done the same. This is just returning what you've given, dear. Let it balance." And then she was gone, leaving the baker alone with her thoughts and her work, and the strange new feeling of having been cared for, of having received instead of only given, of understanding that perhaps nourishing herself wasn't selfish but necessary, wasn't weakness but the only way to continue doing the work she loved without it slowly destroying her. The afternoon passed differently than usual, not in any dramatic way, but in small shifts that accumulated into something noticeable, something that felt like the beginning of change, even though she couldn't quite articulate what was changing or how. Only that accepting the mother's help that morning had created a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. The wall that said she was fine, she could handle everything. She didn't need anyone else's support or care or concern. She found herself eating lunch, actually eating, sitting down with one of the sandwiches she'd made for customers and consuming it slowly instead of standing at the counter and taking hurried bites between tasks. The shop was quiet during the lunch hour, most people already home or at work, and she used the stillness not to prepare for the afternoon rush or to clean equipment that was already clean, but to simply sit, to let her body rest for 15 minutes without guilt telling her she should be doing something more productive, more essential, more aligned with her identity as someone who never stopped moving. The post carrier came by around 3, his usual time, and today, when he asked how she was doing, she surprised herself by answering honestly. "Tired," she said, the word feeling like confession, like admission of weakness. "Really tired. I've been tired for a long time, I think." He nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already known. And she realized that, of course he'd known, that everyone in Willowmere had probably been watching her exhaust herself for months or years, had been waiting for her to acknowledge it, to ask for help, to stop pretending that perpetual motion was the same as thriving, you know, he said, selecting a scone from the display case and waiting while she wrapped it. "There's no virtue in working yourself into the ground. The village needs you, yes, but we need you healthy, sustainable, not burned out and barely functioning." The words were gentle but direct, and she felt them land somewhere deep, adding to the accumulation of care that had been building since yesterday's soup, since this morning's breakfast, since the mother's quiet assistance that had made the work feel less overwhelming, less impossible, less like something that would eventually break her if she didn't find a way to carry it differently. "I don't know how to do it differently," she admitted, and saying it aloud felt both terrifying and relieving, acknowledging limitations she'd spent years denying. "This is the only way I know. Wake early, work late, give everything. It's who I am. It's what you do," he corrected gently. "Not who you are. You're more than your work. Even if your work is important, even if people depend on it, you're allowed to have boundaries. To close early sometimes, to take a day off. The village will survive. We'll manage. We'd rather manage occasionally than lose you entirely because you've depleted yourself completely." He paid for his scone and left, and she stood behind the counter thinking about his words, about the distinction between what you do and who you are, about whether it was possible to separate her identity from her labor, when labor had been her identity for so long, when being the baker had meant being the person who was always there, always open, always providing, never asking for anything in return, because asking felt like failing, like not being enough, like letting everyone down. The bookshop woman came in around 4, which was unusual. She typically only visited in the mornings before opening her own shop, and she moved through the bakery with that quiet, thoughtful manner she had, selecting a loaf of bread, and then, unexpectedly, selecting a second one, holding both while she approached the counter. "One of these is for you," she said, setting the second loaf down with gentle finality. "For tomorrow morning, so you don't have to bake before you've even had breakfast, so you can sleep an extra hour if you need it." The gesture was small, but the meaning behind it was enormous permission to rest, to take less from herself, to accept that one morning without fresh bread wouldn't destroy the bakery or disappoint the village, that her needs mattered too, that she was allowed to prioritize her own rest over everyone else's convenience. "I can't just not bake," she said, though the protest felt automatic rather than genuine, the words she was supposed to say rather than what she actually believed. "You can," the bookshop woman replied simply, "just once, just to see what happens. I think you'll find the world doesn't end, and I think you'll find you need it more than you've been letting yourself admit." After she left, the baker stood alone in the empty shop, holding the extra loaf, feeling its weight in her hands, the bread she had made, but that someone else was giving back to her, nourishment returning to its source, care flowing in both directions instead of only outward, and she found herself crying, quietly, just a few tears that she brushed away quickly before any late customers could arrive and see her breaking down over something as simple as bread. But it wasn't about the bread, not really. It was about being seen, about having her exhaustion acknowledged, about people in the village refusing to let her disappear into her work, refusing to accept her self-sacrifice as inevitable or admirable, insisting instead that she deserved care, that she was worth protecting, even from herself, from her own tendency to give, until nothing remained. She closed at 6, as usual, but this time, when she locked the door and flipped the sign, she didn't immediately begin the cleaning that usually took another hour. Instead, she left the dishes in the sink, left the floors unswept, left everything in a state of manageable disorder that tomorrow her could address. And she climbed the stairs to her apartment, feeling simultaneously guilty and liberated, as though she was breaking rules she'd made herself follow for so long. They'd started feeling like universal laws rather than arbitrary decisions about how to live. Upstairs, she heated the soup the cafe listener had brought. There was enough left for another meal, and while it warmed, she changed into comfortable clothes, the soft, worn things she usually saved for the brief hours between bed and work. She ate at the small table by the window, watching evening settle over Willowmere, watching lights come on in windows, watching the village transition from day to night in that gentle way it did, unhurried and peaceful, and she felt herself settling too, some internal tension finally loosening after being held tight for so long. The soup was still good, still warming, and she ate slowly, tasting each spoonful, noticing the care that had gone into its preparation, the attention to seasoning and texture, understanding in a new way that when someone cooks for you, they're offering more than food. They're offering their time and attention and the desire to nourish you, and receiving that gift meant accepting that you were worth the effort, worth the care, worth being fed. After dinner, instead of watching television or immediately preparing for bed, she did something she hadn't done in months. She drew a bath using the clawfoot tub that had come with the apartment but that she'd barely touched since moving in, always too tired or too rushed to bother with anything more than quick showers. She filled it with water as hot as she could stand and added the bath salts she'd bought years ago and never used. And she lowered herself into the heat and felt it work into her muscles, easing the persistent ache in her back, the tension in her shoulders, the bone-deep weariness that had become so constant she'd stopped recognizing it as abnormal. She lay there until the water began to cool, until her fingers pruned and her body felt loose and heavy with relaxation. And when she finally climbed out and dried off and slipped into bed, it was only 8 o'clock. Ridiculously early by normal standards, but exactly when her exhausted body needed to sleep, and she let herself surrender to it without guilt, without the usual litany of everything she should be doing instead, just accepted that sleep was what she needed and allowed herself to need it, to claim it, to believe she deserved it. Tomorrow she would wake at 3:45 again, would return to the bakery and the bread and the endless cycle of feeding others. But tomorrow she would also have the mother's lesson fresh in her mind, would remember that accepting help didn't make her weak. He would know that the village wanted to care for her, the way she'd been caring for them, and perhaps, slowly, she could learn that nourishing herself wasn't selfish, but necessary, wasn't failure, but wisdom, wasn't taking from others, but allowing them the gift of giving back. She lay in bed as darkness settled fully over Willowmere, the village growing quiet in that particular way it did each night, as though the streets themselves were exhaling after the day's gentle activity, releasing whatever small tensions had accumulated, and allowing stillness to return to reclaim the space that daylight and motion had temporarily occupied. Her body felt different tonight, still tired, still carrying the accumulated exhaustion of years, but somehow lighter too, as though accepting care had created space inside her that had been filled with the weight of refusing it, the effort of insisting she was fine when she wasn't, the constant vigilance required to maintain the fiction that she needed nothing from anyone while spending her days providing everything to everyone. Through the window, she could see a few stars visible between the buildings across the street, their light distant and steady, and she watched them without trying to make meaning from their presence, just letting them exist as points of constancy in the darkness. The way the bakery existed for Willowmere, something reliable, something that would be there tomorrow morning, even if tomorrow morning she slept an extra hour, even if she used the bread the bookshop woman had given her instead of baking fresh, even if she prioritized her own rest over the village's convenience for once. The thought should have generated anxiety, should have triggered the familiar spiral of guilt and responsibility and fear that she was failing everyone by not being constantly available, constantly productive, constantly giving. But lying here in the quiet dark, her body clean and warm from the bath, her stomach full from soup someone else had made, her muscles finally beginning to release their chronic tension, she found she couldn't summon that anxiety, couldn't make herself believe that one morning of sleeping in would somehow undo 12 years of reliable service, would somehow make her less worthy of the village's respect or affection. She thought about the mother arriving with breakfast, about how natural it had felt to accept that help once she'd stopped fighting it, how the work had been easier with two sets of hands instead of one, how the morning had felt less overwhelming when someone else was sharing the load. She thought about the cafe listener's soup, about the post carrier's words, about the bookshop woman's gift of bread, and she understood that these weren't isolated acts of kindness, but a pattern, a community trying to take care of one of its own, trying to return some small portion of the care she'd been pouring out for years. And perhaps she was allowed to receive that. Perhaps being cared for wasn't a failure of strength, but an acknowledgement of shared humanity, of the fundamental truth that people needed each other, that independence carried too far became isolation, that the ability to give and the ability to receive were both essential to genuine connection, to sustainable community, to lives that didn't slowly consume themselves from the inside out. Her breathing had slowed without her noticing, falling into the deeper rhythm that preceded sleep, and she let it happen, didn't fight it with the usual mental catalogue of tomorrow's tasks or the replay of today's interactions, just allowed her consciousness to soften at the edges, to blur the way it did when exhaustion finally claimed you and you were too tired to resist anymore. She thought drowsily about bread, about how dough needed time to rest between risings, how rushing the process created inferior results, how patience was essential to proper fermentation, to developing flavor and structure and all the qualities that made good bread good. Perhaps people were like that too, she thought. Perhaps rest wasn't weakness but necessity. Perhaps trying to rise constantly without pause just meant you never fully developed, never reached your potential, because you were always operating from depletion rather than abundance. The mother had said something that morning, something about how you couldn't pour from an empty cup, and the baker had heard it but not really absorbed it, not let it sink past her automatic defenses. But now, hovering in that space between waking and sleeping, the words returned with new weight, new meaning. She had been trying to pour from empty for so long that empty had started feeling normal, had become her baseline state, and she'd forgotten what it felt like to have reserves, to have something left over after giving, to feel nourished rather than depleted. But tonight she felt nourished, fed by soup and porridge and the gift of bread, fed by kindness and concern, and the village's gentle insistence that she mattered, that her well-being wasn't separate from theirs but connected to it, that they needed her healthy and rested and capable of continuing, not burned out and broken and unable to do the work she loved. Sleep was pulling at her more insistently now, that gentle undertow that would carry her down into darkness if she let it. And she let it, allowed herself to drift, to release the day and all its small revelations, trusting that they would still be there tomorrow, that this shift she'd felt wasn't something that would disappear with morning, but something that might possibly begin to change how she lived, how she worked, how she understood her relationship to care and giving and receiving. The village was silent now, or near enough. Just the distant sound of wind in the trees that lined Willowmere's streets, the occasional creak of old buildings settling, the soft, atmospheric sounds that filled every night and that she'd learned long ago to find comforting rather than disturbing, proof that she wasn't entirely alone, even when she felt isolated by her work. By the early hours, she kept that separated her from most people's normal rhythms. But maybe she didn't have to be so separated, she thought dimly. Maybe there were people willing to join her in that early morning darkness, willing to share the work instead of letting her carry it alone, willing to care for her the way she'd been caring for them. If only she would let them, if only she would stop insisting on independence that had become indistinguishable from isolation. Her last conscious thought was about tomorrow, about waking at 4:30 instead of 3:45, about using the bread that had been given to her instead of making it herself, about accepting that one morning of rest was not betrayal, but wisdom. Not selfishness, but necessary self-preservation, not weakness, but the kind of strength that knew its own limits and honored them instead of pretending they didn't exist. And then thought dissolved into sleeping, into dreams that were soft and unformed, into the deep rest that comes when you finally allow yourself to stop, to be held instead of holding, to receive instead of only giving, to trust that the world will continue turning even when you're not pushing it, that the village will survive even when you're not feeding it, that you are allowed to rest. The night deepened around her and around Willowmere, holding the village and everyone in it with the same gentle patience it always did, asking nothing, expecting nothing, just being there the way it was always there, reliable as the bread she baked, constant as the care she gave, endlessly available for those who needed it. And tonight, she needed it, needed the darkness and the quiet and the permission to stop being anything except a tired woman who had worked hard and deserved to sleep, who had given much and deserved to receive, who had nourished others and deserved to be nourished in return. The bakery would be there tomorrow. The ovens would heat, the dough would rise, the village would wake and want bread, and she would provide it the way she always had, the way she always would. But tomorrow she would do it a little differently, a little more gently, a little more sustainably, with a little more care for herself, woven into the care she gave to others. And that, she understood now as sleep finally claimed her completely, wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was wise. It was the only way forward that didn't lead to breaking. Sleep well, dear baker. You have fed so many. Tonight, let yourself be fed. Let yourself rest. Let yourself receive the care you've given. You are worthy of it. You have always been worthy of it, and the night will hold you gently, the way you've held so many others. Rest now. Tomorrow can wait.